Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to be talking about the Chinese Civil War. Now this video is going to be focused on the material that you would need to know about the Chinese Civil War as an IB student, and it's going to be part of the Causes and Effects of 20th Century Wars unit. Now broadly speaking, the Chinese Civil War can be divided into two parts: 1927 to 1937, and then again from 1946 to 1949. Ultimately, the Chinese Civil War is a struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, GMD or KMT, depending on the translation that you have. So, what we're going to be going over in this video is the main reasons that the war broke out and a little bit of historical background. Now, big picture-wise, a lot of the background of how the Nationalist Party was formed, how the Communist Party was formed, isn't really relevant. For the most part, IB examinations will focus on the role of ideology. It'll focus on the major events that were responsible for the outbreak of the war and the motivations, I guess you could say the extent to which certain factors played a role. In any event, let's dive right in. Now, the story starts 1911. There was a revolution which would overthrow the Qing dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty. Now, China had been in a very bad state for a long time. Ever since the Chinese started fighting wars with foreign powers, they were forced to capitulate to foreign demands, and the Qing dynasty was corrupt, it was ineffective, and it really didn't manage to modernize China or to establish a strong Chinese national identity. For the most part, China was carved up between foreign powers, and as you can see in the picture that I'm linking now, China was seen as a country that wasn't really sovereign in any way. It was just being bossed around by other nations. So 1911, the revolution was basically composed of a number of anti-Qing groups taking part in protests, demonstrations, riots, eventually overthrowing the power of the Qing dynasty. Now, officially speaking, a new Chinese republic was going to be formed with a Chinese nationalist Dr. Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Yat-sen, depending on the translation you use, as the new Chinese leader. The problem was Sun Yat-sen wasn't really known in China. He didn't really have any political clout, despite the fact that he was a Western-educated doctor, progressive political thinker, a man with really big ideas for China. He wasn't influential in Chinese politics. So instead, Chinese, I guess you could say Chinese warlords, Chinese political figures felt more comfortable placing their trust in Yuan Shikai, one of the last military strongmen of the Qing dynasty. They knew him. They basically knew who Yuan Shikai was. They were more comfortable giving power to someone who was already part of the old government. This is not terribly uncommon, by the way. A lot of the time when revolutions take place, you'd be surprised at how many elements of the old government survive. Main reason for this being that people have established that whether or not they were corrupt, they knew how to run the country, for better or worse. In any event, Sun Yat-sen ends up being sidelined, and Yuan Shikai ends up being the new Chinese leader in 1912. Now, Yuan Shikai, predictably, decides that he's not particularly interested in maintaining the democratic status quo. Unfortunately, Yuan Shikai is also not a very strong leader, so he's a dictator, but he's ineffective. Now, in 1915, Yuan Shikai is issued a list of 21 demands by the Japanese. Essentially, the 21 demands state that he would have to accept Japanese power in the region and allow Japan to do as they wanted. Now, in 1916, after accepting the demands and after humiliating himself in his country, Yuan Shikai dies. With no real power at the top, the Warlord Era begins. So, now China is ruled over by a series of warlords, each one ruling in a different territory. Sun Yat-sen returns to China in 17, and he tries to set up his own republic, but he doesn't really have any support. Now, Sun Yat-sen gets the idea that he can appeal to foreign powers. He contacts Western powers first, but he's not really able to get any headway with them. After some doing, he's able to communicate with the newly formed USSR, and he is able to contact them about receiving money, military assistance, and military advisors. They set up a military training academy, and the Nationalist Party, the GMD, starts establishing a presence as a military force. Now, in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party is formed. The Communist Party initially isn't that big, but it starts gaining traction. It manages to attract some Marxist, socialist, and other leftist ideologues, and they become pretty active in Chinese politics. So, since the USSR is helping Sun Yat-sen, they insist that he work with the Chinese Communist Party. It's important to note that Sun Yat-sen himself was left-leaning. Now, the three major principles that Sun Yat-sen advocated were nationalism, democracy, modern government, and wealth redistribution. People have translated and interpreted these points differently, but they boil down to leftist, socialist reforms, nationalism, obviously, and fair government. Now, what happened is in 1922, the GMD, Nationalist Party, and the CCP, Communist Party, start working together. It's a productive partnership. The GMD is able to supply a regular army, and they're able to supply military forces. The CCP, meanwhile, had a lot of members that were familiar with the urban areas. They had contacts. They knew local criminals and gang leaders, people that could help them, and they were instrumental at dismantling the support of the warlords. So, the warlords didn't really stand a chance, and before long, the Nationalist Party starts getting more headway, and they start basically pushing aside really any traces of warlord power. So, the Northern Expedition is launched in June of 26, and this is their, I guess you could say, push to eliminate the warlords. The problem is the GMD and the CCP start having internal differences. See, the GMD was nationalistic and somewhat left-leaning. But in 1925, Sun Yat-sen dies. His replacement, Chiang Kai-shek, is a military man who's not very taken with the idea of leftism. In fact, he's downright suspicious of leftists and leftist politics. He becomes increasingly suspicious of the communists, and he starts to worry what their motives are, what their objectives are. So, in January and February, the communists start leading strikes in various cities throughout central China. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, besides being someone who wasn't particularly fond of leftism, was a man who had a lot of powerful friends who were landowners, businessmen, just the type of people who would stand to benefit very little if there were a communist revolution. In fact, they would lose a lot. So Sun Yat-sen's successor, Chiang Kai-shek, decides that he needs to take action. It's been debated to what extent the communists were willing to actually turn on Sun Yat-sen, but the consensus is they were planning on eventually taking power from him. Moreover, the USSR was planning on only working with the communists and withdrawing its support from the socialists. So, he decided to hit first, and in April of 26, he decides to attack and essentially order a massacre of Chinese communists in the city of Shanghai. He has very little mercy on them. Anybody who's suspected of being a communist is instantly captured, and many of them were imprisoned, even more were killed. And he started to expel any leftists, any communists, or any socialists from the GMD. It became more or less a right-wing party. So, the idea is he officially begins the splits. So, some people take this as the start date of the Civil War. Others reason that the Civil War started closer to 1927 when the Chinese Communist Party officially declared that it was going to start fighting back. So, this video is covering causes mainly, so let's just try to get a better sense of the causes of the war and try to understand what motivated each side. So the GMD was a nationalist party, originally founded by a left-leaning political activist, and it had to work with the USSR. So to examine the relationship, the USSR wasn't happy about working with a party that wasn't purely communist, but they needed an ally in China, and they figured this would be a good idea. And the GMD wasn't ecstatic about working with the USSR, but they also needed military support from a foreign nation, and so they decided this would be the best idea. So, why the communists were able to gain a foothold is based in China's economic situation. In 1900, there were peasants that suffered from economic hardships. They had very few opportunities for economic advancement. Very few of them owned any land. So the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, appealed to them on a lot of levels, and they had a lot of reason to believe that it was in their interest to join with the CCP. Similarly, the GMD wasn't very willing to accommodate this, and they were suspicious of the communists and their objectives. So there's a map that I'll put up right now, and it'll give you guys an idea of geographically what China looked like. As you'll notice, most of China's urban areas were concentrated in the east. So obviously there's going to be a lot of key areas and key events that take place in the east of China. So the main concern for the Chinese communists was trying to nip it in the bud. The thing is, you have to understand that the CCP and the GMD worked together, but it was a friendship of convenience. It wasn't really something based in mutual trust or even really the same goals. So that wraps up this video. I'm going to be putting up another video that describes how the war progressed and how the communists were able to get a foothold, and another video that examines the effects of the Chinese Civil War. Spoiler alert, it's the rise of communism in China and the dictatorship of Mao Zedong. So, if you guys would like some reference to this, the textbook that we're using in our IB course, the German School IB course, is Pearson IB, Causes and Effects of Wars. The second edition is currently available on Pearson's website. I'll have a link in the description below. Aside from that, there are some good texts on the rise of Chinese communism that I'm also going to link. But for the most part, in any exam situation, you really want to try and focus on ideology and how it contributed to the outbreak of the war, because that's really the key. And in the next video, we'll examine how the communists were able to capitalize on their political support and defeat the nationalists. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you have anything that you want to explore in more detail, feel free to leave it in the comments below.